Hello, you multi-magnetically moaning malingerers. Yeah, and thank you to Caroline McCabe for providing the Malt Mention to Ralphie Review 983 extras. Welcome to my channel. I am Ralphie, Ralphie.com, home of in-depth whisky appraisal, good quality spirits appraisal, understanding. I'm not an expert, I'm just very experienced, and I'm sharing my journey with you so that your journey has a more accurate roadmap which is useful to you, so that when you buy whisky, bourbon or any other spirits like rum and mezcal and cognac, you make fewer mistakes, you know what you're buying, and you make sure that you don't overpay for what you're getting, because this is really important. This is what keeps us motivated to continue as customers, rather than be frequently disappointed to the point that we just walk away completely from what we used to love, and we find an alternative hobby like table tennis or long walks in the country. You know, more healthy stuff. Anyway, I have got my blackboard out today. My subject is, how long is your bottle of whiskey going to last when you've opened it? Because you'll find fairly early on in your journey, particularly when you're talking to other whisky aficionados, that the question arises about the fact that someone's opened a bottle of whisky and it changed within a few weeks, and it was a really special whisky which was only for occasional sips because it was quite expensive, and then after a few months it just wasn't the same. So going online or reading the books for explanations delivers this phenomenon called oxidization. Now, I want to explain it to you, and importantly, why you should not be frightened of it. Because oxidization is nothing to be alarmed about in your opened bottle of whisky. In fact, a lot of the time it's actually doing good to the beverage. Now, let me explain what oxidization is. It is the absorption of the oxygen gas in the air that's adjacent to the liquor, right? And as the oxygen is absorbed into the ethanol, it breaks down some of the flavour dynamic, and eventually it kind of flattens it off, and your whisky starts to go a little bit stale. It just loses its magic. Now, essentially, first and foremost, careful where you store your whisky. It definitely happens. It can happen, but not as much or as often as you might believe. The sort of whiskies that are most vulnerable to oxidization over time are your really old fragile whiskies. These are the ones that tend to be put into crystal decanters that are not quite rinsed properly, and then they're put in windowsills in direct sunlight, or they catch the rays of the sun at some point of the day coming through the window from the outside world. Now, nothing damages whisky faster than direct sunlight contact. And this is where green and brown bottles have an advantage over clear bottles. They tend to hold on to the integrity of the whisky for longer on bright summer days, even when your bottle's not directly anywhere near the sunlight. Also, another factor is heat. Heat in particular, in hot climates, your old bottles or your heavy phenolic bottles that have got these long molecular chains of compounds, they tend to break down in very high temperatures. So if you can keep them, even most importantly, away from direct sunlight, or even in a room which is a little bit cooler, perhaps the north facing room of your house, or in a basement where it's a little bit cooler, then definitely you wouldn't keep it in the attic, which is probably the hottest point of a house in a warm climate. So it's just being mindful of that. You don't actually have to have specialist fridges But although some people do have, because they're very, very precious about their very expensive single malts. So fair play. If you've got the money, invest as you see fit. But for the majority of us who are buying younger whiskey, which is more spirit driven, we don't have to concern ourselves about oxidation so much. And I'm going to explain why very shortly. But before I do so, I would say that in fact a certain amount of oxidization gradually over time after you've opened a bottle will 9 times out of 10 actually improve the delivery of the whiskey to your palate in terms of smell and taste. Here's an example. Now, I was mentioning this is an old Benriach from 1998, single cask sherried version. I opened that bottle 6 years ago. Look how much is left. Why haven't I finished the bottle after a few months? Simple, here's the answer. There's no rush. What is the rush? This is like a library book. You know, you buy a book, you read it, you put it in your bookshelf, knowing that in maybe a year or 2 years or 6 years, you'll come back and you'll read it again and you'll get more out of it. And therefore your investment will deliver more return. It's exactly the same with a bottle of whiskey. A bottle of whiskey, particularly when it's sealed in the right conditions, can last hundreds of years, if not thousands of years. We already have bottles of wine which are of considerably lower alcoholic strength, lasting perfectly intact for over 100, 150, 200 years. Granted, eventually, they do turn a bit weird. And yes, I admit it, some whiskies, due to their provenance and the luck of their circumstance, they can turn a wee bit weird. But never forget, when a bottle of whiskey can turn weird, one that you've bought from the auction, it can turn weird the right way or the wrong way. So it can either be a very strange experience but unforgettable and positive, or it can just be kind of really, really awkward. And you've got to put modern whiskey in it just to round it off and blend it up. So here we have the Benriach 1998. I'm going to pour a wee drop, share it with you. This bottle has been opened for 6 years. I opened it for the first time about a few weeks ago for a conversation with my Patreon subscribers. And this bottle is going to last probably 10 years. It certainly helps that it's bottled at cask strength. This is a major factor. High strength whiskies, and in this case 56.1%, is going to last over time far more successfully than one bottled at 40%. 40% whiskies, once you open them, oxidize relatively quickly. Cask strength whiskies, 46% integrity whiskies, and high strength whiskies, they won't oxidize so quickly because, quite simply, with more alcohol in the bottle, they're harder to oxidize, particularly for the small amount of air or oxygen in the air that's trapped in the bottle. That's the way it works. So, what you have here is a wonderful, raisiny, soft, gentle, intense, delicious, fantastic 88 out of 100 single malt. In my old score, 90 out of 100. Easy. New score, 88 out of 100. A sip, and I'm sipping it neat. I don't even have to add water. It's been the little jaggy edges of tannins from that sherry cask have rounded off. It's settled down, but it has lost none of its expressiveness. In fact, if anything, it's become even more expressive. And the presence of the sensations is more confident, it's more engaging. The sweet and the sour and the slight, very gentle, almost a hint of saltiness. And that just note of bitter, particularly in the development. Absolutely delicious. I'll add a wee drop of water now. Will adding water drown it? No. But the tricks of the trade, Well, particularly with old whiskies, just add a wee drop of water at a time. Never add your water all at once. I tend to add the water all at once because I'm doing a 20-minute odd review. I've got to speed things up a bit. If I'm rehearsing these whiskies, it's taking me a couple of hours. I'm adding water over the space of half an hour, just gradually, till I reach the pitch perfect bliss point. And that's the way it works. So here we have a fantastic survival single malt. 6 years the bottle's been open, nothing wrong with it. I kept it in a cupboard, north facing wall, never sees sunlight. It's on display, sure. The label has weathered, as you can see, where for a year I stored it in a garage and that did it no harm. This is what you get. This is it. And recently I've just reviewed a whiskey. Perfect candidate, young, phenolic. You can keep that bottle open. It's higher strength, 46.3%. This isn't going to oxidise anytime soon. What will happen though is the phenolic component will just round off a little bit after a year, maybe 2 years. But it'll still be interesting, still engaging, and if anything, the casks that the Bunnahabhain were matured in, I've just reviewed, they will have softened. They will have integrated more, married together due to bottle conditioning. So, when we're talking about oxidisation of whiskies, we tend to talk exclusively about it being a risk when it's bottled. But we never ever consider that an essential part of cask maturation of any cask matured spirit anywhere in the world is oxidisation. It's an essential part of it. So this is why I've got the barrel here, because when the barrel is filled to the brim, right, with new make spirit, oh jeez, oh, this is me being right-handed but backwards, right, too. When that happens, there's very little air gap at the top of the cask where the bung is. But gradually, due to the fact that 2/3, roughly, I'll get enough different colour than that, 2/3 of the content is ethanol. The rest is water. The ethanol is molecularly lighter than water. And if we were in the tropics, the water and the ethanol would evaporate out in duppy share or devil's share at roughly the same time. In fact, in rum from the Caribbean, the alcoholic strength can actually increase over time in the cask, which means it becomes more solvent and then extracts more out the cask, which is why generally with rum they use less active casks. It's just easier to manage. However, with Scotch whisky, northern or southern latitude whiskies, so whether it be New Zealand or Scotland or Canada, what you'll find is it's ethanol which tends to evaporate gradually or permeate. I said evaporate, it can evaporate, but in fact it permeates through the wood because the wood is semi-porous. The wood breathes. When it breathes in, it breathes out. It breathes according to the temperature, the external temperature, the amount of air movement, and the adjustments in ambient temperature in the warehouse that's around it. And what happens is, over time, some of the alcohol starts to disappear. And as it does, it creates an airspace at the top of the cask, and that brings in oxygen into the cask, which then combines very, very measuredly with the alcohol that's maturing, and it helps to bring about the maturation and the rounding and the results that we want to buy when we purchase a bottle of whiskey or any other spirit. you'll find that certainly in fortified wines like sherry, where they have a kind of crust over the top to help regulate oxidization, the oxidization is an essential feature of the maturation of basically any fortified wine. In fact, any wine at all, but with red wine and white wine, the engagement with cask wood must be very closely monitored, because a little bit too much oxidization can have severe impacts on the final results of the wines, because they're more fragile, more vulnerable to oxidization because of their lower alcoholic gravity. Most wines are 12 to 14%. Some are lower. And my goodness, when it comes to beer at 4 to 6%, basically you've got to stand watch over it and sample it every day just to make sure. So over time, the fill level in the cask goes down, rightio, and continues to go down. The older the whisky gets, the more oxidization accelerates within the cask, dependent on temperature fluctuations, the density of the wood, the location in the warehouse, the desire and need for particular signatures to have more oxidization to really express themselves successfully. You know, that does vary. Some whiskies work so well when they're younger, and others, they need more time. Glengrant needs more time in the cask to absolutely sparkle and shine, whereas Isle of Arran, as a young whisky, 10, 12-year-old, is absolutely fantastic. It's way ahead of many of its older rivals. So here you have oxidization no longer, we're not even at the bottling stage yet, but it's happening in the cask, and we never complain about it. We never fret about it. We never worry about it. We never suffer anxiety about how long the casks are going to be stored in the warehouse before they over-oxidize. It's really not our problem. It's the producer's problem. But here's the golden rule. The ultimate age gaps for a matured Scotch whisky to be at its best is generally 18 to 25 years old. When the Scotch whisky is getting older, what you need is less active casks, and you need to contain the oxidization. What do? They'll take two barrels of older 30-year-old whisky, and they'll put them together into one cask to fill it right up to the top again, to reduce the oxidization as it ages from 30 to 40, even to 50 years. And they'll make sure it's in the coolest part of the warehouse, where it's the least reactive in terms of temperature. You see, old casks need to be managed. And because there was no demand for old casks in the old days, in the 1990s, 80s, 70s, early 2000s, you got some absolutely banger whiskies from the independent bottlers. They were exceptional. They're hard to find now. They're outrageously expensive. And I have to say, in my opinion, they're not worth the money. They're really not. When I see 21-year-old single malt being sold, bottled at 43%, which means it's been chill filtered, for £500, and if you buy it and you open it and you go, it's nice, but it's a special bottling because it cost me £500. I'll just leave it in my cocktail cabinet where everybody can see it, and see about a year later you'll come back to it and you say, where's my whiskey gone? That cost me £500 for that 21-year-old whiskey that was heavily chill filtered so they could bottle it at 43% and make more money out of me. And because they did, and it's older whiskey at a lower strength, the oxidization has accelerated. So these people will go on to, bless them, it's not their fault, they're not to know. They'll go online and they'll ask people, why is my whiskey failing? Why is it oxidizing? And then they'll get the horror stories. Yeah, whiskey doesn't last once you've opened the bottle. You've got to drink it up. I think you guessed that one came from the marketing department to accelerate turnover, don't you? That's the sort of flannel mythology that gets made up on a fairly regular basis in the industry. And for the experienced of us, it just gets really quite patronising. So just ignore it and see the folk that have got issues with their oxidisation concerns. We're in a position to advise them, to guide them. And if you know anybody, direct them to this video where they can come and learn a little bit about why oxidisation is a really, really good thing during maturation. And even when you go into the bottle, you don't have to worry about it. But if it's really old whiskey, anywhere near sunlight, and bottled at 43%, I can tell you right now, your alarm bells should be ringing. And finally, if you're wondering why your old whiskey isn't tasting like it should, never ever forget that some fly little highwayman or highwaywoman or highway person, whatever, may be coming in your house if they're not already in your house, and they may be pouring a wee dram of your valuable old whiskey and topping up with cold tea. Or even worse, blended scotch. Hey, it happens. I'm going to finish now with a little anecdote. It's this sort of things that I discuss when I'm doing my live streams for Patreon subscribers, is that there was a gentleman brought his small whisky collection of about a dozen bottles to the auction house, thinking that they were very valuable because they were Islay whiskies, and he got them as gifts from clients because of his business. And they were really special bottlings, and he put them in a row, and he sat patiently waiting for the auctioneer's valuation. And the auctioneer's looking at the bottles, and he says, yep, the label's right, the bottle's right, the contents, high neck fill, yep. And then the auctioneer turns to look at the top, and then of course he notices the top's wrong. The cork was in fact from another bottle. In fact, the whole seal was from another bottle. And instead of his 30-year-old Ardbeg, his bottle was sealed with 12-year-old Bowmore. He'd never noticed because he didn't know about whiskey. His collection was valueless. Do you know why? Because he didn't like whiskey, he didn't drink it. I'm Ralphie, I hope you've enjoyed this. This is my extras. This is what it's all about. We extra malt moments on location in the bothy with some graphics. Why? Why the chalkboard? Because very, very few people online will use a chalkboard, because they're all using the editing suite and all the rest of it, and you've seen all that. So you want something that's just nice and quaintly old-fashioned. So here I am with my quaint old-fashioned off button to stop the camera recording. Bye-bye.